Hello, everybody, and welcome into the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats. It's the beginning of spring in the Northern Hemisphere. The temperatures are getting warmer here where I live in West Virginia. We have more hours of daylight, and I won't be able to take an easy breath until sometime close to Thanksgiving. But I'm willing to bite the bullet because we're getting closer to baseball's opening day, if you don't count the two games the Cubs and Dodgers played in Tokyo earlier this week. The O's open up the season in Toronto with a 4-game series against the Blue Jays, which of course is the favorite team of one of my good friends and one of my guest co-hosts, Jay, up there north of the wall. Jay, hopefully, Toronto has a better season than they did last year, and you are welcome for Anthony Santander. But enough of the friendly rivalry between the Orioles and Blue Jays. Listener, you want to hear about today's book. It's the third of the short story compilations I've covered here on the podcast, Tales from Jabba's Palace, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. All of the stories in the compilation revolve around the events at Jabba's palace that we see in Return of the Jedi. And I'll talk more about the book coming up in a few moments. But first, it's listener question time. Today's email comes from Jacob in Austria, who wrote a very nice message, but I had to edit it down just a little bit for the show. Jacob says, I recently rewatched all the Star Wars movies, and one thing I noticed during it was that I kind of started to dislike Yoda. Watching the Clone Wars animated show growing up, I always thought of Yoda as this wise being who is thoughtful and always knows what's best. But I noticed that he makes a lot of wrong decisions. For example, Yoda doesn't want to take Anakin into the Jedi Order initially, even though there are strong indications that Anakin could be the chosen one. When Anakin tells him about his visions of losing a loved one, Yoda offers little to no help except repeating the same old teachings about the dangers of forming attachments. And Yoda doesn't want to train Luke at first, even though Luke is seemingly the last hope to defeat the dark side because Yoda is so beholden to the old Jedi code. I know Yoda has his reasons, but it rubs me the wrong way because he always seems to prioritize being in line with the Jedi Code above everything else. What do you think about my opinion? And are there any characters you liked at first and became to dislike over time? Well, thank you very much for the email, Jacob. I think your opinion's spot on, and I think George Lucas would agree with your opinion. Part of the story of the prequels is how rigid adherence to institutions can inhibit people from doing what is right. I don't think it's saying that institutions themselves are bad, but when the people inside those institutions get so entrenched in the rules and regulations that govern them, even when those rules are inhibiting the institution's ability to function properly, something's wrong. And the people that run and work in those institutions need to be able to recognize those situations and adjust the rules and regulations to make those institutions work better. The Jedi Order failed because it became so rigid in thinking that it needed to enforce its own rules and to help carry out the laws passed by the Republic. It forgot what it means to be a Jedi, to help the people that need help, to mediate conflicts, and to protect the galaxy from the dark forces that threaten it. Now, Jacob, as far as your second question goes, I honestly can't really think of a character that I've changed my opinion on to a great degree. There might be some that I like a little more now than I did initially, or some that I like a little less, but I've never really done a 180 on a character. Maybe the closest is Poe Dameron. I liked Poe in The Force Awakens. He's cool. He's a wisecracking fighter pilot who's a bit of a hothead. Now, Poe wasn't one of my favorite characters in The Force Awakens, but he was fine. But I didn't like the storyline in The Last Jedi where Poe tries to lead a mutiny against Admiral Holdo. And then I really didn't like it when Leia told the few remaining Resistance fighters alive at the end of the movie to look to Poe as their new leader. To be fair, that last part wasn't really anything that Poe, the character, did. But I have never been a fan of stories where a subordinate character tries to lead a revolt against their leadership, learns that they're wrong, and then is given a leadership position later in the story. Thanks again for the email, Jacob. Now, listener, if you'd like to ask me a question, just send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com or send me a message on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Twitter at swlegendslounge. And if you'd like to get your voice on the show, just record a short message and email it in. But please record it in MP3 audio format. Now it's time for today's book, Tales from Jabba's Palace, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. Grab yourself a drink. Let's head in to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Tales from Jabba's Palace was first published in December of 1995. It follows Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, which was published in July 95. Both short story collections tell the tales of the various characters that we see in A New Hope and Return of the Jedi, respectively. There are a lot of similarities in the ways the books are written. Some of the stories are funny. Some of the stories are more tragic. The difference, in my opinion, is how the stories orbit the events that we see in the films. In Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina, almost every story revolves around the events of Luke and Obi-Wan entering the cantina, meeting Han and Chewie, and escaping on the Millennium Falcon. All but maybe one or two. The stories in Tales from Jabba's Palace cover a little more territory. Yes, most of the tales feature the rebels arriving to rescue Han, Luke fighting the Rancor, and killing Jabba above the Sarlacc pit. However, there are more things happening in Tales from Jabba's Palace. There are spies, assassins, sycophants, all trying to take over Jabba's organization or trying to destroy it. There are 19 stories in Tales from Jabba's Palace. I'm not going to go talk about all of them. That would be extremely repetitive and it would get boring. I'm just going to highlight a few stories that I liked and a few that I didn't. My favorite story in the collection is the last one, Skin Deep, The Fat Dancer's Tale, written by A.C. Crispin, the author of the Han Solo trilogy. The story follows Yarna, the Askagian dancing girl who was left at the palace when Jabba and his entourage flew out on the sail barge to the Sarlacc pit. Now, when word returns about Jabba's death, chaos breaks out at the palace, with people fighting over control of the Hutt's former empire. Yarna realizes this is her opportunity to escape. With the help of one of the palace guards named Doalan, Yarna pockets a few gems from Jabba's safe and heads off to Mos Eisley. That's where Jabba has been holding Yarna's cubs for about a year. The two steal a speeder and make their way across the Dune Sea. Yarna tells Doalan that she was the daughter of a chief on Askaj and one of the planet's most celebrated dancers. She was stolen from her world along with her husband and children and sold into slavery. When they arrived at Jabba's palace, the Hutt sent her cubs to Mos Eisley and then fed her husband to the Rancor. Now, Yarna just wants to rescue her cubs and find a nice, quiet planet to settle down on. Doalan tells Yarna that he was known as a great hunter on his homeworld of Jaren. He says he answered Jabba's call for hunters to capture a crate dragon, but Dwalin says he ended up drunk one night and gambled away a year's service to the crime lord. Now the two decide to use the gems Yarna took from the palace to free her cubs and buy passage off the planet. But the plan hits a snag when they're ambushed by a real krayt dragon. The beast attacks the speeder, but Yarna and Dwalin manage to leap free before it's destroyed. Then Yarna distracts the krayt, allowing Dwalin to sneak behind it. The hunter leaps on the dragon's back and shoots it in the brain, killing it. Yarna loses her gems in the speeder, but Dwalin recovers something even more valuable: 5 krayt dragon pearls. Yarna helps the injured hunter the rest of the way to Mos Eisley. They use the pearls to free Yarna's cubs, buy their own starship, and flee Tatooine. This was my favorite story in the collection because it ended on really a hopeful beat. After Yarna and Dwalin save each other during their journey from Jabba's palace to Mos Eisley, they decide to form a partnership. Maybe something that will grow into a romance. They're able to free Yarna's children, her cubs, from captivity. Jabba has been keeping the cubs at one of his buildings in Mos Eisley. But rather than risk having to buy passage off of Tatooine, Yarna decides that since Dwalin has proven himself such a good friend, she and her cubs are going to go with him after he purchases a starship. It has a happy ending for 2 characters that we learn have been beaten down by Jabba the Hutt and his criminal organization. It's called the Fat Dancer's Tale. However, we learn that Yarna is not always the size that we see her dancing around Jabba's palace. It turns out her species, the Askagians, can hoard water in their bodies on desert planets, on harsh, dry planets, similar to how camels do here in our world. It turns out the Askagians can drink gallons, liters of water. It makes them much larger than what their normal size is, and it allows them to go longer periods of time without water. By the end of the story, Yarna is not as large as we see her in Return of the Jedi. She has sweated out a bunch of water on the journey across the Dune Sea to Mos Eisley. And it's nice in the story that they don't talk about Yarna's size the way we see her in Return of the Jedi and the way other members of Jabba's court talks to her, calling her derogatory names like fat and ugly. And it turns out Dwalin is one of the very few characters in Jabba's court that has any preconceived notions about Yarna's or any other character's appearance. During the 3-day trip from Jabba's palace to Mos Eisley, the two travel mostly at night to avoid the heat, and they rest during the day. As they rest during the day, they tell each other stories about themselves. They grow closer. Maybe it will blossom into a romantic relationship, but it seemed to me like they were just growing closer, that this was a budding friendship, that they began to care about each other's well-beings. Yarna was kidnapped from her home world. Her husband was kidnapped. They were sold into slavery. Her cubs were held, being used against her, forcing her to dance for her owner. When they arrived at Jabba's palace, her husband was fed to the Rancor almost immediately, just for Jabba's entertainment. Yarna is devastated, but she has to continue dancing. And then Dwalin, on a night of drinking and revelry, is tricked into gambling away his own freedom. These are two characters that have been beaten down by life, by Jabba, and it's nice to see a story where the characters end up in a good place. They get Yarna's cubs back. They get off Tatooine. They're free. And now they get to make choices about what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. So that was my favorite story in the book. Now let's talk about one I didn't really care for. And then there were some, The Gamorrean Guard's Tale by William F. Wu. The story follows Gartog, who is described as the least intelligent of the Gamorrean guards at Jabba's palace. Even the other Gamorreans think Gartog is pretty dense, and they refuse to select him one night when Jabba announces that the next morning he's going to take a trip to the pit of Carkoon. That night, Gartog stumbles across the corpses of a kitchen boy and a Bomar monk. Gartog lifts both corpses over his shoulders and carries them around, trying to investigate their murders. Now, Gartog actually solves the murder of the kitchen boy. It's Danik Jericho, the Anzadi assassin that we originally saw in the Mos Eisley Cantina in A New Hope. But when he tells the guard captain Urtug what he has found, Gartog still isn't allowed to go on Jabba's sail barge. Now that ends up being good for Gartog, of course, who leaves Tatooine after Jabba and the other Gamorreans are killed on the sail barge. And he decides to take the rotting, mummified corpses of his two new friends with him, carrying the kitchen boy and the Bomar monk everywhere he goes. I didn't really care for this story. It was probably my least favorite story in the collection. This was one of these stories that was played for comedy, and admittedly, I have a very narrow sense of humor. And this story just was not funny to me. The running joke was how stupid Gartog is, how dense Gartog is. I'm one of those people that after a while, when there's a running joke, I'm like, fine, I get it. Even if I found it funny at the beginning, I no longer find it funny. And some of the stuff that happens in the story is kind of disgusting. The author writes about how as Gartog is carrying the corpses around, there is fluid leaking out of them onto the floor, that as they decompose, it seems as though the bodies are now smiling at Gartog, and he finds that uplifting on some level. And whether or not Gartog is of low intelligence, whether or not Gartog is a little dense, I find it difficult to believe that he continues to carry the corpses around far after the end of the story. For me, it was a joke that just didn't land. For others, it will. Okay, it's time to take a break. When I return, I'll talk more about Tales from Jabba's Palace. I'm Aaron Moats. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. Thank you for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, where we celebrate the books from Star Wars Legends. But let me take a moment and recommend a book from Star Wars canon. Thrawn is a story full of smugglers, pirates, and political infighting. See how the brilliant Chiss tactician climbed his way up the ranks of the Imperial Navy, with a little help from his reluctant aide, Eli Vanto. Check out Thrawn by Timothy Zahn. Welcome back to the Star Wars Legends Lounge, the show that celebrates the books from Star Wars Legends. I'm Aaron Moats, and today I'm talking about the short story collection, Tales from Jabba's Palace, edited by Kevin J. Anderson. So let's talk about a second story I liked in this collection. It's called A Time to Mourn, A Time to Dance, Ulla's Tale by Kathy Tyers. The story follows Ulla and another Twi'lek dancing girl named Cien. The two were kidnapped from Ryloth by Jabba's majordomo, Bib Fortuna. Bib brought the two to Mos Eisley and left them with a human named Jairus Rudd while he went to make arrangements to bring the Twi'leks to Jabba's palace. While they are being held in Mos Eisley, Ulla and Cien have a brief encounter with Luke Skywalker. The young Jedi tries to convince the two dancers to leave Rudd and come with him. But Bib Fortuna arrives. But Bib Fortuna had lied to Ulla and Cien, telling them that Jabba was rich and handsome and that they would live in luxury. When Rudd sees the dancers talking to Luke, he draws his blaster and starts shooting. Cien flees during the firefight, but Ulla isn't able to escape, and she's taken to Jabba's palace. Of course, once there, Ulla realizes that Bib had lied about everything. Soon after she arrives, Luke Skywalker's droids show up at the palace, filling Ulla with hope. Until Ulla's fateful final dance. The one that ends with Jabba feeding her to the Rancor. The story is tragic. I really like getting some of the backstory of Ulla. And she's a hero, it turns out. She enables Cien to escape in Mos Eisley. When Rudd sees them talking to Luke Skywalker, and he starts shooting at the young Jedi while Luke is defending himself, parrying the blaster bolts with his lightsaber, Bib Fortuna shows up. This was the time he was arriving to bring the Twi'lek dancers to Jabba's palace. Bib sees what's happening. He grabs the two Twi'lek dancers and starts to pull them away from the situation. But Ulla is able to distract Bib. She's able to allow Cien to break free of Jabba's majordomo. And she's able to distract Bib long enough to let Cien escape. Once she gets to Jabba's palace, Ulla realizes that she's probably never going to leave here. Either she is going to be a slave for years and years, or she's only going to be a dancing girl long enough until Jabba loses interest in her. And when Jabba loses interest in someone, Oola understands what will happen. Either the person will be fed to the Rancor, or Jabba will eliminate them some other way. But then you get a punch to the gut at the end of the story. Because when 3PO and R2 show up, and R2 projects the message by Luke Skywalker, Oola starts to have hope. The Jedi who tried to help her a few days ago in Mos Eisley is now coming to Jabba's palace. He tried to free her before. Maybe he'll try to free her again. Oola tries to dance her heart out, tries to give Jabba as good a show as she can in order to keep the Hutt's interest. Because she knows the only way she hopes to gain her freedom is to live long enough until Luke arrives. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. As I said, the story is tragic, but I like the way it's written. I like the way Kathy Tyers makes you feel even more for Oola than what you feel watching Return of the Jedi. Finally, I'll talk about one more story from this collection that didn't really work for me. It's called Tongue-Tied, Bubo's Tale by Daryl F. Mallet. Bubo is the frog dog that we see C-3PO bump into in Return of the Jedi at one point. C-3PO rounds the corner, accidentally kicks the frog dog, and it barks/croaks at him a couple times. In this story, we learn that Bubo is actually a very intelligent spy and assassin. When Bubo arrives at Jabba's palace, he's taken in as a pet by the drunken Gran Reyes. Bubo learns that the local Imperials have hired Reyes to kill Jabba using an explosive. The Gran has an Imperial surgeon insert a small computer beneath Bubo's skin to order the bomb components. The computer is very uncomfortable for Bubo. Still, the frog dog is patient. After Reyes orders all the components and they have arrived, the Gran starts to assemble the bomb and stashes it on Jabba's sail barge. However, Bubo swallows the detonator, foiling Reyes' plan. After Jabba's death, Bubo, who had stayed at the palace and had not gotten on the sail barge, allows the Bomar monks that are still wandering the halls of Jabba's former palace to remove his brain and place it in one of their jars, where Bubo spends the rest of his existence pondering the complexities of the universe. Not my favorite story. It is the shortest story in this compilation, so it doesn't take long to read. It's only about 5 or 6 pages. But it's another story that is played for comedy, and for me, the joke just doesn't land. Watching Return of the Jedi, I never considered the frog dog a character. It's literally called a frog dog. Frogs and dogs in our world are animals. They have limited intelligence. They are pets. They're not really sentient species. I'm not going to sit here and nitpick everything about the story. I just think the reason it didn't resonate with me on a positive level is because I don't find Bubo the frog dog, a spy and assassin, interesting at all. So there's really nothing more for me to say about this story. Again, there are 19 total stories in this compilation. There is a story about Bib Fortuna. There is a story about Tessic the Quarren, who is one of the characters that we see peering down into the Rancor pit after Luke falls down in there. There is a story about Malakili, the Rancor caretaker. There is a story about EV-99, the torture droid. That one is kind of interesting, where we learn that EV-99 originally was torturing droids at Cloud City, that the droid escaped when it discovered that Lando Calrissian was looking for it. When Lando arrives at Jabba's palace, EV-99 assumes that Lando has tracked it down. Well, it turns out it is just a wild coincidence. Lando has no idea that EV-99 is there. However, one of the droids from Cloud City that EV-99 had tortured does track the torture droid down and leads a horde of broken droids that EV-99 has tortured over the years to slowly encircle EV-99. And the story ends with the reader imagining EV-99 finally getting its comeuppance. So that was kind of interesting. There's a story about Boba Fett in the Sarlacc pit. Boba Fett has some hallucinations, it seems. He's hearing voices. Some of the voices may be from the Sarlacc itself. Some of the voices may be from previous people that the Sarlacc has consumed. So it's kind of a trippy, weird story, and it's kind of interesting, and you don't exactly know what is real and what isn't. So that one's kind of cool. And one of the other memorable stories is one about Mara Jade, written by Timothy Zahn. If you remember, in the Heir to the Empire trilogy, at one point, Mara tells Luke that she was in Jabba's palace, knowing that Luke would come try to save Han Solo from the carbonite. In this story, Mara Jade infiltrates the palace as another one of the dancing girls. However, try as she might, she is unable to convince Jabba's guards to allow her a spot on the sail barge as it heads out to the pit of Carkoon. So, after word makes it back to the palace that the sail barge has been destroyed, that Luke Skywalker and the rebels have escaped and have left Tatooine, Mara gets a vision of the Emperor, who calls her a failure and recalls her from her undercover job as a dancer. It's something cool to read if you want the full Mara Jade story. Well, it's time to wrap up. I understand this was a little bit different of an episode, but I think the best thing to do is to just give you listeners a sprinkling of the stories in these books, tell you what I like and what I don't, and then you can decide for yourself if these short story compilations are books that you want to pick up. So, if you have a question for me, or if you want to share an opinion, share a comment, share a character group, or you'd like a Star Wars book recommendation, send me an email at swlegendslounge@gmail.com, or send me a message on Blue Sky, Instagram, or Twitter at swlegendslounge. Coming up on the next episode, we return to our normal episode format and we jump back to the Imperial era, just a few years before the events of A New Hope. It's Han Solo at Star's End by Brian Daley, the first of the Han Solo adventures published in 1979 and 1980. You can look forward to that episode coming out on April 4th. Thank you so much for listening to the Star Wars Legends Lounge. I'm Aaron Moats. May the Force be with you. And remember, there's always a bit of truth in legends.